Hi everybody, Mike Slater here, and today I'm going to talk about observational methods and archival research. So what I'm going to talk about in this brief podcast is first I'll discuss quantitative and qualitative methods for describing behavior. Then I'll move into naturalistic observation, talk about what it is and some methodological issues like participation and concealment. I'll move into systematic observation, and then I'll discuss methodological issues such as the use of equipment, reactivity, reliability, and sampling. I will describe the features of a case study, and then I'll finish by discussing archival records. Okay? Alright, to get started, first I want to make the general distinction between quantitative and qualitative approaches to research. You're probably already relatively familiar with this, but I just want to review it here before getting into observational methods. Now, quantitative research typically focuses on specific behaviors that can be easily quantified. So you can think about, in an observational sense, trying to determine how frequently a person smiles. That's something that could be relatively easily quantified, that someone could observe and actually keep a tally mark. We're able, by collecting data like this, we can assign numerical values, so we can essentially assess how many times did a person smile, and we can use larger samples, and so we can actually do the data analyses that we actually like to do. Okay, so we can make more generalizable statements based on a large sample size, and we can make assertions, and we can test theory by collecting this quantitative data. Okay, so the observing smiles example is one that would be observational in nature. A personality survey would be something else. It's quantitative. It's not observational in nature, but it's something that would use quantitative data. Of course, it would use numerical numbers and so on. People would be assigned a score based on how they do on a certain personality trait, and then we can analyze that data. Okay, the majority of research that we do in IO psychology is quantitative in nature. Less frequently, we see qualitative studies. Qualitative studies do not involve numeric information. Rather, they primarily rely on observational methods, and they focus on behavior in natural settings. Okay, so qualitative measures are trying to get at a rich tapestry of detail about a very specific type of behavior. So maybe they are, a person is trying to observe how children interact in a specific playroom. Okay, they don't have specific behaviors that they're trying to tag, rather they're generally trying to understand how children behave. Typically, this involves smaller groups with limited settings. So this might be a focus group, this might be a small group of children, or so on. A focus group would probably be more common for what you might see in IO psychology. When the data is being analyzed, typically it's all written data, okay? It is transcribed, it's recorded and then transcribed, and the responses are sort of sorted into themes, okay? So let's say that, and I'll talk a little bit about my own research, let's say that we're trying to understand what causes customer incivility. Well, we ask people about their experiences, and then we find out some people say it has to do with their emotions, some people say it has to do with their service, and then we sort of sort these sentences, these statements, these ideas into themes, okay? The data still isn't numerical, but it can give us a really good idea about what the phenomenon at hand actually looks like. It can give us richer detail than we can get with just a quantitative approach. So some researchers, particularly in IO psychology, will say that qualitative research is useless, that it's all about the quantitative. But that's not true. These are really complementary approaches where they can both be useful in certain situations. For instance, qualitative is incredibly useful when you're formulating theory, when you really don't know exactly why or what behaviors are going to occur, and instead you just observe. You observe and you write things down and you get an idea of what's happening. And based on what's happening, you can start to come up with a theory. Second, qualitative can be useful when you're focusing on very unique cases. From a more clinical standpoint, if we were looking at somebody with a very specific disorder, we could interview that person, talk to that person, follow that person, and figure out, well, what's going on with that one person. And that can inform us about a lot of different behaviors. Okay, you can think of HM, the guy who had his hippocampus damaged. We know so much more about memory because of HM, but if we only focused on quantitative, well, we wouldn't know much about HM because he's a sample size of 1. Finally, qualitative is incredibly useful for just describing behavior. What does the behavior look like? How does it happen? Are there precursors to that behavior, antecedents? What are the outcomes of that behavior? Okay, it can give us a much closer look at what the behavior looks like. We would miss all of this if we were looking at quantitative studies. In terms of quantitative is much better to test theory. Okay, if we believe that certain variables are antecedents and outcomes, we can figure out quantitative ways to measure them, and then we can test that theory in one integrated numerical model. Okay, in terms of constructs, we can get a better idea of how constructs relate to one another. We can find out if we have good measurement techniques and so on. Quantitative is also useful because, well, typically we want generalizable findings, right? And when we're looking at a small qualitative group, a lot of times those findings aren't very generalizable. So if we have a large sample size, particularly if that sample size is random, then we end up with more generalizable findings. Finally, quantitative data is more useful for explaining the cause of behavior. Okay, again, we have a larger sample size. We can identify important antecedents, and then we can actually test the model to figure out what variables are explaining more variance in the variable we're interested in. For instance, if we're interested in aggression, we can assess a bunch of theoretical precursors to aggression, and then we can measure those quantitatively, and we can relate those to aggression, the variable of interest. Now just remember, these are complementary approaches, okay? Qualitative typically precedes quantitative, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But just keep in mind, one is not necessarily better than the other. They're different from one another. Now, on to naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation is typically thought of as field work or a field observation. Sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. Basically, this is when a person makes observations in a natural setting over a period of time using a variety of techniques to collect information. Of course, one of the most popular and well-known naturalistic observation studies was on Jane Goodall, who essentially lived with the primates, and she observed them at first and became more involved in their day-to-day lives and so on. But you can think of even the research that we do, to not even so much research, even job analyses. Oftentimes our employees, IO psychologists, will look at jobs. They'll follow a worker around and figure out what they do and describe what that person is doing. Okay, that's not formally research, but nonetheless, this method can be used to describe what a person does in their job. Generally, that's the purpose of naturalistic observation. It is to describe, okay? It's to describe how people live, work, experience a setting, and so on. You see it in a lot of different fields, although it might be biggest in sociology, but nonetheless, we see a lot of naturalistic observation in psychology. Now, naturalistic observation really demands that an individual immerses themselves into the situation. So the researcher is really going to be observing everything. They're going to observe the setting, patterns of personal relationships, how people react to events, and so on. The goal is really to provide a complete and accurate picture of how these people interact with one another, with the environment, not necessarily to test hypotheses, but to get a really clear understanding of how people are interacting. Okay? There are a lot of different techniques to conduct naturalistic observation. Usually these, again, are kind of complementary. Oftentimes this involves observing, so actually just watching how people interact, like Jane Goodall did with the apes. You can think about maybe in a situation where a developmental psychologist is watching children. They would just watch the children, see how they interact, maybe through a two-way mirror, maybe in person, and so on. It can involve interviewing, actually talking to the people, asking them how they feel, why they did specific behaviors, what they're planning on doing. It could also incorporate survey documents. Okay, this could be a quantitative survey, a qualitative survey, but primarily this data collected is qualitative. So the goals here are to describe the setting, the events, and the people, analyze these categories, the patterns. Okay, remember, sort the data, type the data out, and then sort these patterns so we have a better understanding of what the data looks like. Now, something interesting here is that the events, the outcomes, are really interpreted by the researcher. So two researchers in the same situation could interpret them very differently. So again, this is going to be more subjective than the quantitative data, but nonetheless still very important, because naturalistic observation can help us generate hypotheses and research questions to explain the data, and that could be followed up with a quantitative study. Okay? Of course, the final goal is to write up the report of the results and try to have that report published. Now, with naturalistic observation being somewhat subjective, there can really be a lot of issues there. The first issue is participation. The question being, should the observer participate or just watch? And this is a tough one. If a person becomes an active participant, well, first of all, they might lose objectivity. Okay, it's hard for, say, a reporter who is getting very close to the people they're reporting on to stay objective, and they might not be able to report the results objectively. Additionally, if they're participating, well, people's behavior might change, so that could be an issue. But if they don't participate, if they don't watch, they may not be immersed in the experience. They're not close enough to the experience, and they can't describe it as well. A second issue is concealment. Should the observer conceal his or her purpose? Well, first, if they don't conceal their purpose, this could alter the outcome. People become more reactive to things in the environment that might elicit the behaviors that the researcher is looking for. But if the researcher conceals his or her purpose, there may be ethical concerns, right? That they're just watching these people, waiting for things and recording behavior, and the participants, the people being observed, don't know that they're being observed for this reason, so this could really impact their privacy. Finally, it's important to identify the scope of the observation. In an observational study, when you're trying to immerse yourself into the setting, it's really easy to lose focus. Okay, maybe you're doing a study on aggression, but you start to get more and more involved in ancillary relationship information and so on, and you lose focus on the aggression. So it's incredibly important to make sure your scope is narrow enough that you can stay true to the purpose of the study. It's important to realize that naturalistic observation has several strengths. The first, useful in complex and novel settings. Think of Jane Goodall. That's about as novel of a setting as you can get, and she learned more about the primates than anyone ever had before by observing them and becoming involved in their day-to-day lives. But always using qualitative data. Okay, there wasn't quantitative data collected, and this was incredibly useful. It's also useful in measure and theory development. As I said before, when you don't really understand what's going to happen, why people behave in a certain way, you can start by observing. You can write down the data and try to understand antecedents of behavior, the behavior itself, outcomes of the behavior, and that would give you an idea of, well, why these relationships exist, and you can develop theory as a result. Now, that isn't to say naturalistic observation doesn't have limitations. So naturalistic observation, again, is limited by what can actually be observed. Okay, there are certain constructs that can't be observed. You can't necessarily observe what people are thinking. You can't observe people's personalities. Well, you can, but not to the same accuracy that they can tell you about their personalities with self-perceptions. Okay, so not everything can be studied from an observational standpoint. Naturalistic observation isn't going to be as useful when we're studying well-defined hypotheses under precisely specific conditions. You just have a lot less control with naturalistic observation, and you can't really collect the type of data that you need to test these hypotheses under these conditions. Okay? With naturalistic observation, one of the things that naturalistic observation is marked by is the fact that researchers come in with a specific research question, and then as they're watching the behaviors, they have to revisit their research question, and maybe they start coming up with hypotheses. But as these behaviors develop and as they collect more qualitative data, they have to continue to reanalyze and revise the hypotheses. It becomes a very time-consuming process to conduct naturalistic observation. Now, every once in a while, too, you end up with a situation where you have a case or two that don't fit the explanatory structure that you've come up with. You have a couple of cases that are behaving differently from everybody else, and so you have to conduct a negative or deviant case analysis, and you have to revise your patterns and revise your hypotheses. Again, pointing out the fact that this naturalistic observation is very complex, and only a couple of deviant cases really could influence your results quite a bit. The second type of observation I want to talk about is called systematic observation. Systematic observation you may see a little bit more in psychology, particularly in workplace psychology. Systematic observation is when there is careful observation of specific behaviors in a particular setting. The behaviors are then coded to say whether or not they are present. Let me give you an example. So Catherine, my wife, and Steve Jacks conducted an observational study of incivility and obesity, and this was actually conducted at Panera and Bowling Green State University. So they sat at Panera and they coded incivility based on how frequently the cashier smiled at a person, how much eye contact they made, and a couple other indicators of incivility. And it actually assigned the person a value based on how uncivil they were. They then related the incivility to perceived obesity of the patron, of the customer, and they rated that based on an obesity scale. It showed different pictures of people, and they matched the customer to the proper picture. Okay, I did an observational study with monkeys back in the early 2000s, and what I had to do was I had to track the monkeys for about an hour, and I had to say what behaviors the monkeys were doing every 30 seconds. So at 30 seconds, I look up, I see what Shoeless is doing. Shoeless is being social with a Lou. Okay, another 30 seconds, I say Shoeless is being aggressive with a Lou. I'm coding what the behavior looks like. Instead of just writing down qualitatively what the people are doing, I'm actually providing a code. Now, systematic observation can be really useful because you can actually analyze the data. You have quantitative data for analysis. You can determine relationships between variables, but it still has some methodological issues. So number one, the question is, should we code as we're observing, or should we record and then code later? And that's something that has to be decided. I mean, some situations it's not appropriate or ethical to have a video, such as at Panera. I mean, Katie couldn't have just sat there with a video camera watching people interact. That might have been a little weird. So she had to observe. Whereas other situations, you could easily use a video recorder and code the data later. Second, reactivity can be a concern. Just being there, just observing may impact a person's behavior. So for instance, with the monkeys, I actually had to go into the monkey room and I had to sit in the corner motionless and silent for 30 minutes before the monkeys forgot I was there and started to behave normally. So we know from things like the Hawthorne studies that just being watched can impact behavior, and that's an issue here too with systematic observation. And then there's reliability. Should we just have a single rater assessing the variables of interest, or should we have multiple? If we have multiple raters, of course, that's going to be more reliable, but at the same time, it's going to be more time-consuming. So that's an issue that you have to bring up as well. Finally, sampling can be a concern. Trying to determine who to sample, when to sample them. In the Panera study, they would probably get very different outcomes if they we're sitting there at 9 o'clock at night when the employees were tired versus 9 o'clock in the morning when the employees were, relatively fresh. So it's important to think about what the sampling structure should look like. Next, I want to talk briefly about case studies. Case studies are really an in-depth investigation of a single individual. Okay, you see these most commonly in clinical psychology and in business programs where there's a case study of an organization where that organization takes place as an individual. And you can learn a lot from investigating these rare or unusual cases. Think about HM, the guy who had his hippocampus damaged. We learned so much about memory from HM. Think about Jeannie, the girl who was chained in a closet during her critical period. We learned about language acquisition. Think about Enron, the organization that did some really unethical things. And we learned a lot about unethical behavior, and we learned a lot about groupthink. So case studies can be very important. They may not be that generalizable. Okay, so really case studies should not be generalized to all situations. If you worked in a business and you found that your business worked in this specific way and reacted to an event in this specific way, that tells us a lot about your business, and it gives us an idea of how other people might act, but it's still really a sample size of one. And you should treat that as a starting point other than making your assertions. That's why IO psychology is so much better than business. Business studies use case studies as sort of the end-all be-all, and we realize that case studies should really be treated like a starting point. As one more aside, a very specific type of case study is called a psychobiography. This is when a researcher applies a psychological theory to explain the life of an individual. For instance, clinical psychologists have spent a lot of time doing psychobiographies on Adolf Hitler, trying to explain his behavior. And so they determined that he had specific psychopathies, that he had specific psychological disorders. And all they did to gain this information was they didn't have direct interviews with Adolf, of course, but instead they read accounts of his life. They may have found diaries. They interviewed people who had interacted with him to come up with that psychobiography. Okay, so that's just a very specific type of case study that's important to know about. The last thing I want to talk about is archival research. Archival research can be qualitative or quantitative, and it involves using previously compiled information to answer research questions. Some of the most common types of archival research are conducted using statistical records. So census data, baseball stats, the educational and testing services, they collect all of this data. And a lot of times you can have access to this data. You might be able to call up the census and get a license to analyze their data, the data that they have, and you can look at relationships. Baseball stats are pretty easy to find. Educational testing services, well, they tend to keep their data pretty close and secure, but nonetheless, they can use that data to conduct research. Survey archives are relatively common and something that's often publicly available where you can conduct research with that. For instance, the General Social Survey is a survey in the United States that's conducted every couple of years, I think either 2 or 4 years, can't remember offhand, and it assesses a random sample of United States citizens on a variety of variables. Maybe 1 year it'll be stem cell research, 1 year it'll be aggression in the workplace, religion, a lot of different questions. And people can gain access to that and they can actually conduct research. A final area for archival research, and you won't see this as often in IO psychology, more in social psychology, sociology, and so on. But people can gain access to written and mass communication records like newspapers, magazines, and they can sort of do an analysis, a content analysis of that data, more of a qualitative analysis, to try to understand what's going on during that time. Okay, so that's a brief and dirty look at archival research. Archival research is often available to the public. You can find data sets if you look hard enough, and a lot of times those data sets have really interesting variables that can answer a lot of really important questions that no one's looked at before. So don't discount archival research because it can be incredibly valuable. So I think that about wraps up my discussion of observational methods, case studies, and archival research. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know. Have a good day, everybody.